So Jesus said to those who had come to believe in him, "If you remain in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free." But they answered, "We are the descendants of Abraham. We have never been slaves to anyone. So how can you say we will become free?" You see, they answered Jesus in the same way we might. I mean, we're Americans, right? We live in the land of the free. We sing songs about it. We get together and have parties and fireworks, all to celebrate our nation's freedom. But Jesus was speaking of a different kind of freedom, a freedom that can only be found in him. He answered them, "This is the truth. Everyone who chooses a life of sin isn't free. They are a slave to sin. A slave has no permanent place in the family. But a son or a daughter, they belong forever. So if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed."
Welcome. This is the state of religious freedom around the world. That's what we're calling this webinar today. And welcome to everyone out there watching on Facebook Live, on our YouTube channel, and those who aren't watching today but will be watching in the future. We're happy that you're also joining us. My name is Steve Allred. I am the Religious Liberty Liaison for the Northern California Conference. And you know, we thought that since tomorrow is the 4th of July, a day when we here in the United States, you know, celebrate our nation's birthday, we think about freedom, that it would be a good opportunity for us as Christians to talk about religious freedom, not just here in our country, but around the world. What is going on with religious freedom around this globe? Because sometimes, you know, we get living our lives and maybe we don't know what's happening on the other side of the world, and things could be happening that we could perhaps have an impact on if we were to actually kind of focus in on them. I should also mention that we are thinking about those who are being affected by the wildfires here in Northern California right now. And we'll be, as this is happening right now, there are folks who are having to flee from their homes. And so we want to just remember them. And actually, I'd like to start with a word of prayer. And let's just pray for those who are being impacted by the fires, as well as our conversation today with a really great guest that I'm looking forward to talking to, Tina Ramirez. Let's just start with a word of prayer, and join me and bow your heads if you would. Father in heaven, we thank you for giving us freedom, the freedom to choose. Jesus died so that we could have the freedom to choose life. And today we are here to talk about freedom on maybe a little bit different level, how we treat each other and how people are being persecuted around the world for their faith. We pray that your Holy Spirit would be a part of our conversation. We also lift up those who are in harm's way today because of natural disasters around the globe. We think of the fires right here in California. Be with them, be with the first responders, the firefighters out there on the front lines, and those who are having to flee from their homes. We lift them up to you. We pray again for you to guide our conversation today. In Jesus' name, amen. So let's talk about our guest today. I am really honored that our guest, Tina Ramirez, has agreed to join us for this conversation. She is an international expert on international human rights. And as we have our conversation about the plight of Christians and other religious minorities around the globe, and how we can help, we would love to take your questions if you have any. So we'll try to watch the comment section on our Facebook and YouTube pages. You can type in your questions there, and we'll try to catch those as we go along. Let me share a little bit more about our guest before we invite her on to the video here today. Ms. Ramirez is the founder and president of Hardwired Global, a nonprofit organization that specializes in human rights education and training to promote peace and pluralism worldwide. Tina brings to Hardwired more than 20 years of experience as an educator, policy advisor, and expert on international human rights and religious freedom. She has worked in more than 30 countries and travels regularly to the Middle East and Africa. She has spoken before the United Nations and the African Union and testified before the United States Congress. Tina's educational programs, which have been published in several journals, have provided significant evidence of successful methods to help children overcome hate and intolerance, build resiliency against extremist thinking, reduce violent responses toward minority groups, and improve treatment of women and girls. She is the author of Iraq, Hope in the Midst of Darkness, published in 2017. She's a contributing author and editor of Human Rights in the United States, a dictionary and documents that was published in 2010 and again in 2017, and the author-editor of Human Rights, Great Events from History, published in 2019. She previously served as a foreign policy advisor for the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom and also to the U.S. Congress, where she founded the bipartisan International Religious Freedom Caucus. She is the former director of government relations and international programs at Beckett Law. She holds a certificate from the International Institute for Human Rights in Strasbourg, France, a Master of Arts in Education from Vanguard University, and a Master of Arts in International Human Rights from the University of Essex in the United Kingdom. She now lives in the suburbs of Richmond, Virginia, with her daughter, Abigail. And in 2020, Tina was a candidate for the United States Congress there in Virginia. So with that, I am going to bring Tina into the conversation here. Hello, Tina.
Hi, Steve. It's great to be with you.
Thank you so much for joining us here in Northern California, all the way from Virginia. Probably, is it as hot out there as it is here? 100 degrees or so?
No. I mean, the wildfires, my heart goes out to you guys. It looks horrible. I mean, we definitely, we've had a little bit of rain lately, but today's cooler. It's been in the 90s, but it's amazing that actually, I think the West Coast has been worse than the East Coast this last couple of weeks.
Yeah. Well, anyway, beautiful part of the country out there. I actually went to school in Northern Virginia, so I love that part of the country. Hey, we're here to talk about religious freedom. And again, I just thank you for joining us. I know it's a holiday weekend and everyone has plans. And so this is probably, on one hand, it's a good time to talk about these things. On the other hand, it's like, hey, wait a minute, what are we doing having a webinar? But we won't make this extremely long, but I am really happy that you in particular can speak to these issues because you obviously have expertise in this area. You've traveled widely. You have experience. You're not just talking from a theoretical standpoint. And so I'm looking forward to hearing more. Persecution has been a reality for the church from its very beginning, right? I mean, we see in the Bible passages where Peter and Paul, Paul says, those who live godly in Christ Jesus will suffer persecution. That doesn't mean that we should throw up our hands and do nothing about it, though, right? And especially, I think personally, and I want to hear more from you, obviously, on this, that the golden rule when it comes to Christians about how we should treat others who are being persecuted, even of other faiths, really plays a big part in, how the response that we ought to have. But let me start out with a question for you, Tina. Many of us Christians here in the West, I'll speak for myself and perhaps others I know, we might be largely ignorant of what's going on elsewhere in the world on a lot of things, a lot of the time, unless it somehow affects us. And so a lot of our viewers maybe have only read about religious persecution. I get a magazine every so often from the Voice of the Martyrs, and I get, keep up with them, and I read some stuff from other organizations out there. Does persecution because of one's faith still happen in the world today?
Yes, and thank you for that introduction. I mean, it does, sadly. In fact, it's getting worse. When I started, I've been engaged in the battle for religious freedom for about 20 plus years. It's really what inspired me in my life work and in my career for the last 2 decades. But when religious persecution began to be really quantified by the Pew Research Forum, they have a global restrictions on religion report that they started around 2007, I think it was. And they began looking at, what are the restrictions on religious freedom? And they kind of categorize them into two groups: the ways that governments restrict people's faith and ability to practice their faith, and then the way societies actually restrict it or attack you for your faith and your ability to express your beliefs. And so when they started, there was about, I think, 67% of the world's population lived in countries that were highly restrictive, where they had laws that, for instance, like blasphemy and apostasy laws, where you could be put to death for saying something offensive against religion, laws that prevented you from converting or changing your religion, from choosing your religion or belief. It goes on. There's just a number of laws and restrictions. For instance, even in Iraq, where certain faiths are not permitted. So like the Baha'i faith in Iraq is not permitted. It's illegal. And Baha'is were routinely rounded up and imprisoned. We see this all over the world. So there's legal restrictions from the government or from their policies. And I could go on and on about those. And then there's social hostility towards this freedom. And the social hostility is not as easily quantifiable in the sense that there's not a law or a court case or something. It's where society really attacks people for their beliefs. And so you see this play out in many countries, but in particular, countries like India, where you have mob violence against Christians and Muslims and other religious communities that they don't like or want to shut down. And so they literally, mobs come out, rape, kill, torture people of different faiths. And that's just one example, but I could give you many examples all over the world. So government and society. So in 2007, it was around 67% of the world's population. But today, as the data is getting better and more conclusive, the way that they do the research is better. I think it's over 89%. So you basically have 9 out of 10 people in the world's population living in countries that are highly restrictive, whether it's from government or from society. So this is a real problem, and it's a trajectory that's worsening over time. And that's, in the last 14 years, I guess. So if you consider that trajectory, we're on a really dangerous path towards global restrictions on one of the most fundamental rights and freedoms that we have. In my view, my organization is called Hardwired because I believe we're hardwired and really embedded in us is this freedom to worship and to believe what we want and to have the freedom of conscience. And I think it's one of the most essential freedoms for any other freedom. And so it's very alarming what we see in the world today.
So those of us who have the freedom to believe and practice our faith according to the dictates of our conscience are really living in the minority, is what you're saying, in the world. We're
literally like 1 out of 10 people are free, and that's it. And this isn't, and I'm not talking about like there's a little hostility here, a little hostility there. That 9 out of 10 are this severe restrictions, both government restrictions or social hostility. So, and that's the majority. A large percentage of the world's population live in countries where that happens. So India, 1.2 billion people, I think, in China, 1 billion people. That's literally, a third, I guess, of the world's population live in those countries and then the surrounding areas. So it's very significant that the countries where this happens are highly populated. And so you see this global trajectory where it's getting worse. And the last decade in particular, I would say, has been very hostile.
So I want to hear some, actual stories, and you're going to talk about, people you've worked with and folks who've experienced persecution. But let me ask you a question that, maybe it's obvious to some people, but for me, and the answer is not an easy one. I'm sure there's many answers, but why do people persecute? Why would someone want to restrict someone else's ability to practice their faith? And again, I know the answer is not, you could probably point to many different answers, but give us kind of I guess an overview of why this happens.
Well, it happens for a number of reasons. I think that ultimately we see this trajectory increasing because it's when when religion and belief are the most important thing to human beings, I mean, even people that are in prison hold on to their faith. It's what keeps them going. In times like you prayed at the beginning of the show, in times of trial, like with the wildfires, or in any time, it's our natural first inclination to go to prayer and to go to the spiritual place where we can hope for something better. And so it really taps into, I think, one of the deepest parts of what makes humanity tick, what makes us different than anything else in creation. And because it's such an important leverage point in the human person, it's also what governments and societies want to push that button, more than anything, or control. Mm-hmm. And so that's why we see, for instance, in communist China, this just overwhelming need to indoctrinate, to re-educate, they say, people of different beliefs so that they are part of the communist atheist system and way of life. So, the Uyghur Muslims are put into re-education camps. Chinese Christians have been put into re-education camps for years, Falun Gong, because they really want to force people into the mold of what the state wants them to believe and do so that they can control them. I think North Korea is probably one of the best and worst examples of a government really imposing on a people a particular belief system. And in North Korea, the government for 3 generations now in the Juche family, or in the Kim Il-sung family, have practiced this idea of Juche ideology, which is the Father, the Son, and the Spirit of Juche kind of merged together into this Trinitarian faith that is really cult worship of the head of state and of the Kim Il-sung family, down now to Kim Jong-un. So this is, and literally people live and die and breathe off of that Juche ideology, and it's indoctrination. It's heartbreaking what people experience there. There's no freedom of conscience. There's no freedom to have your own thoughts. And that's really what these dictatorships want. And then I think when it comes to social hostility, a lot of that has to do, in my opinion, and I think this goes across the board, whether you're in Saudi Arabia or Morocco or America, is this desire to really a fear of other beliefs being valued more highly than your own or what you believe the societies should. And so in Saudi Arabia, they're terrified of anyone practicing any faith other than their own. So you're not allowed to worship anything except for the particular strand of Sunni Islam within Saudi Arabia. We see that, but we see this within communities around the world where people are so afraid of losing their religious culture or heritage that they don't want to allow anyone else to exist within their society. So we see it in Nepal, where they literally destroy the grave sites of Christians and other religious communities that aren't Hindu because they don't want them to be there to practice. They really want to protect their Nepali Buddhist / Hindu culture. And that's, so for them, that's what they do. So it's ill-serving, but it's very self-serving in whether you're a dictator or someone in society that's attacking another group, trying to suppress them. So.
And do you think that bad theology, to get into kind of the religious aspect, plays a part in why people persecute too? For example, if a faith, whatever it might be, somehow, believes that if they allow other faiths to exist or practice, somehow it is, goes against maybe their beliefs as the majority faith, that it could be, the goal is to stamp that out or make sure it doesn't happen. Does that happen too?
Sure. I mean, people use theology and religion all the time to serve their own ends. But, I think that it's important that people understand, sadly, religion can be used as a tool for very horrific things. We've seen this throughout history, but probably most recently with ISIS and the use of Islam to literally just torture women and children and brutalize people of different backgrounds. And so it was horrific what we saw there. But you had a lot of Muslim leaders come out and say, this isn't Islam, and, we shouldn't be this shouldn't be how people are interpreting it or using it. So,
Sure.
I'm not a theologian, and I'm not going to, try to defend any particular faith and what their faith does or doesn't say. But I do think that as a human being, we need to come back to the fact that, the only way for me to believe what I want to believe and to be able to practice it is if I recognize that there is a fundamental freedom for everyone in society to have that same freedom. So my rights ultimately stop where someone else's begin. I can't believe in child sacrifice and, practice something that would actually take away the right to life of another person. So, there's no justification for any kind of belief that actually takes away the rights of another person. There's nothing in the international legal standards for religious freedom that allows that or permits that. So I think it's really important for people to understand that, because that's a question I often get. Religious freedom does not permit acts of violence in the name of religion. They're specifically not permitted. You cannot justify that. And so whatever someone's theology may or may not be, it doesn't really permit them. They have no right to then use their theology to harm other people in a way that would take away their rights. So we do need to live in this marketplace of ideas where we're not afraid of people's differences of belief. I think, one really good example that I can share is when I was young, my parents were divorced, and my father ended up becoming part of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, the Jehovah's Witnesses. And I was raised in the Catholic Church. And so to me, this was really just mind-boggling. I didn't understand it. And so literally throughout my junior high school, college years, my dad and I would get into really serious theological debates. And those debates were very, very hard, very divisive, very troubling. I mean, I can talk theology, at least on, with what I believe as best as any of them. And I understand now better than anything what he believes. But he didn't change me, and I didn't change him. And I think from that experience, I love my father. I'm so grateful that he respects my faith enough to challenge me to be stronger in what I believe and to know what I believe. And I respect him in that same sense. And I think that, sadly in the world today, we live in a society, not just around the world where persecution is severe, but I think within our own country, where people are really having a hard time having relationships with people who believe differently, whether it's on matters of faith or on anything, and being able to love and respect that person. You don't have to agree with them. You can proselytize them and evangelize them and argue as adamantly as you want for what you believe, because gosh, if you really believe it, I wouldn't expect anything less from you.
Sure.
At the same time, there can be space for both of you in a respectful manner. And I think that's more than anything what our own society is really missing. And, we were this beacon of religious freedom to the world, of freedom of conscience, of thought. And I think sadly that beacon is not glowing as bright as it should be.
I appreciate your thoughts. I agree with you. Let's talk about some of your work with Hardwired. Where are you working? I mean, you're describing a world where, close to 90% of the world is experiencing religious persecution. So you've got a lot of options as far as places to work. Where are you focusing with Hardwired Global and your work today? And what are you doing there?
So when Hardwired began, we felt that we could be best served in really providing training to really embed this particular human right, this freedom of thought, conscience, religion, or belief into local cultures that needed it the most. And so we were very selective in the countries where we began working and where we've worked since, so that we could make not only a more immediate impact, but one that could be sustainable, that could have a larger regional impact. And so when we began, we started in Sudan, actually in Khartoum. And at the time, that was 2012, 2013, the South had just seceded. It's actually on its 10-year anniversary now. And they were looking to rewrite their constitution in the North. And so we brought lawyers from Sudan out, and we began to train them in how do you not only write a legal provision for a constitution that defends this fundamental human right, but how do you understand it and articulate and argue for it within a very difficult context, one where it hasn't been respected for decades, where they literally Sudan was, Omar al-Bashir is one of the few people the first person taken before the International Criminal Court for genocide against his own people, for literally bombing, churches in the Nuba Mountains and across the Darfur. We know the genocide there as well. And so, so we were able to help them articulate these freedoms. It was a diverse group of indigenous believers, Muslims, Christians, Communist Party leaders. I mean, it was a very diverse group. And that group went back and was able to argue and articulate their concept of freedom for all people. And it got into the draft constitution. And now, I guess 7 or 8 years later, it's actually being written into the current constitution in Sudan. So we were very focused on where we could have an impact that would have a lasting impact. And the people that we trained others, and it was self-replicating because we trained people that could sustain these freedoms and this understanding for themselves. Often when people go in and do a training, it's this mountaintop retreat experience, and it's great, but then the people really can't sustain it, and they're very dependent on others for outside help. And so our goal has always been from the beginning to break down all of the jargon that they get from the United Nations and this international system on human rights to the point where they can embody it and understand it and embrace it themselves, however they want to articulate it. Because these are universal values, so they should be universally understood in whatever culture or context you come from. And so that's what we did in Sudan. And then from there, a couple years into that, we had an opportunity to work in Iraq. And these are countries that I had worked on for a number of years before that, when I worked for the U.S. government and built the International Religious Freedom Caucus in Congress, which is a bipartisan caucus. So I had done a lot of work on these countries and seen them fall apart. And so when Iraq fell apart with ISIS invading in 2014 and literally a genocide taking place overnight against Yazidi and Christian communities in the north, they asked me, can you please help us, Dina? So I came in and I began to organize leaders from all the different religious and ethnic communities to do the same thing we had done in Khartoum, which is understand and articulate your rights and freedoms. And there have been a lot of conferences. I had seen some of them when I worked at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom from the American Bar Association and others. But none of these, we're really good from the outside coming in and saying, well, this is what the UN says, and this is what Universal Declaration of Human Rights says, and this is what you should do. But until people really can own it for themselves and understand why it's in their best interest and embedded into their local culture, it just doesn't stick. And I think that's the greatest challenge globally, is that we've had this Universal Declaration of Human Rights since 1948, and it really hasn't been embedded into the local cultures to the extent that it needed to be. And so that's what we did in Iraq, starting with those groups of lawyers and activists and advocates and different tribal and ethnic groups and religious leaders. And then they ended up really mobilizing to challenge some laws, so some of those government restrictions and hostilities that were happening within the country. And then they mobilized through social media and through social groups against the social hostility aspect as well. So they came at both sides of the persecution. And then from that, we started working with teachers across northern Iraq. And ultimately, when ISIS moved into northern Iraq, they displaced everyone. And there were 600,000 children still living under their control that they brainwashed to basically hate and kill people who believe differently. And those children were trained to become the next generation of ISIS. And if left to themselves, that's what would have happened. And so we were able to go in with teachers that we had been training since 2014, essentially. And when ISIS was finally defeated, those teachers were trained and prepared to go back into Mosul and the Nineveh Plains and those areas of Sinjar to retrain the children and the teachers. And so that's what we're working on now. And I can share more about that, but it's launched an entire global education project that we've done now, which is really exciting. So.
Wow. And that is such a pivotal place to focus, is on the children, I think, because obviously they're going to grow up with whatever values they're taught as children and become those people, who will believe and act in that way. So that's powerful that you're doing that. So can you give us, I know you've been over there, you've worked in, as you've just described, in these places. Can you give us some stories of maybe individuals that you've worked with, who've been the target of persecution. I know you've done a lot of work with those in the Yazidi faith, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
And maybe tell us a little bit about that faith, what it is, and why they're persecuted, and then maybe give us a story or some stories of people you worked with.
Sure. And the Yazidi community is a very distinct religious and ethnic kind of community. They don't intermarry outside of their faith, so it's
Okay.
a very kind of closed community. And
Yeah.
it is a monotheistic faith, which most people are not aware of. I guess the only way I can describe it, most similar to like maybe the ancient Zoroastrians or something, but it was a monotheistic faith that is a very interesting theology. I would say to Google it because I'm not going to do it justice. Yeah. But as a community, they have suffered greatly under ISIS. Part of their theology is they believe in several angels that were in conflict or that were doing different things. And one of the angels' names is Shaitan. And so the Islamic community often considers that equivalent to Satan. And they then say that the Yazidis are, as a result, considered devil worshippers. And so when ISIS came in, they said that we have the ability to rape, kill, torture any of these Yazidis because they're devil worshippers. They're not part of our faith. They're infidels. And so they literally moved into Sinjar overnight and with zero warning, because in the Christian community of Northern Iraq, they gave them, I think, 24 to 48 hours to leave, which is, horrifying, but very few Christians were killed in that process. With the Yazidis, they literally came in and began to slaughter as many of the men as they could. They rounded up all the women and men. They lined 18 mass graves with the bodies of any man that was of fighting age, so teenagers and above. And then the young boys they used and indoctrinated them to become cubs of the caliphate and to fight with ISIS. And so they were brainwashed. Then the young girls were sent all into a schoolroom or a concert hall and were just raped routinely. They were fed rice that had pieces of broken glass in it. I mean, it was really just horrifying. And I was actually in Iraq when this was happening, and I got one of the Yazidis that was trying to help these girls escape received, many phone calls, but one of the phone calls in particular that I just remember was just a girl crying and saying, just, this is where we're at. Can you please just ask them to send the planes in to bomb us, put us out of this misery? They were, it was brutal what they faced. Wow. And I met one young Yazidi girl who had her face burned with acid from ISIS when she tried to escape. But there were, I think, 6,000 girls that were eventually taken. About a third of them are still never heard of again. Another third, I think, were found, and the other third were killed, possibly, or sold into slavery. But it was horrific what happened. So we met a man, a teacher of a school, a refugee school in Dohuk in northern Iraq, outside the Yazidi area, and he was a Muslim. And he lived in a home that had its wall shared with the local Shia, I think it was the local Shia mosque. And he shared with us, with his two little girls in the room, how when ISIS came in, they were taking all the Shia Muslims and gathering them into this mosque and then just murdering them, and how he could hear it. And he was just hiding with his two little girls in their room, just listening to it, just scared to death. And he finally dressed up as a woman and took his two little girls and fled. And so he was in Dohuk at this principal at this school that he was running with all these kids, and he just cried, and he just said, Tina, I cannot go back home. I can't go back to Sinjar. They're shooting at Muslims. They think that we're all like ISIS, and I'm not, but they think we're all like ISIS. And so I can't go back in there until they learn these kinds of things that you're teaching us. We were sharing with the kids. We had done a backpack campaign where we brought backpacks for the kids, and we brought supplies for them for school and books and stuff. And then these little booklets that we wrote on teaching them about what their rights were. Because for the first time, the Yazidi community never had heard that they had value or worth or inherent human rights. And so we were just trying to reinstill in them that you do have rights regardless of what happened to you, and this isn't right. And when this is when they are defeated and you go back, just know who you are and what your rights are and your dignity and your worth and your value. So, and that goes into then the teacher training that we've been doing. And so now the government of Iraq has given us permission to train all of the teachers across the northern area. And just because they see the impact it makes on these kids, that it actually pulls them out of this cycle of intolerance and hate and fear. It actually helps them learn to value one another and overcome that and live in a place of hope. And I guess I'm happy to share another story of one of the books that we wrote as a result of that.
Yeah, please do. Tell us about your book. I know that you've, from this work with the Yazidi people, you have, I think that was was that the impetus for the book? Or
Yeah. So 2 of the Yazidi teachers that we met and began training that had fled from ISIS, we began doing trainings with them in like 2015, 2016 with teachers. And they developed this lesson called The Peaceful Garden. And The Peaceful Garden is all about it. So we turned it into a children's book, into a story. But the lesson itself went like this. The 2 teachers took their students to a garden and they said, look how beautiful this garden is. It's filled with so many beautiful colors. And they asked the students, these refugee kids, to go and to make a bouquet of flowers. And they said, you can pick any flower, just don't choose this one particular color. So the kids went and they made their bouquets and they came back and they were so proud of their flowers, holding them up. And the teacher said, they're beautiful. They said, now, but look back and see what you did to the gardens. They looked back and the kids were like, oh no, we destroyed it. And it was like just really ravaged. And the teachers, these 2 Yazidi men, said, this is what happened in our country when ISIS came in. They destroyed everyone except for the people that looked like them. And the kids all just became tearful and very emotional because they remembered at that moment what happened when they were forced to flee. And the teachers said, do you want to live with this garden or do you like the other one better? And they said, no, we like the other one better. And they said, okay, well, would you be willing to help us replant it? And the kids said, sure. So the kids came together and they paired up with different kids they were in this refugee camp, and most of them didn't share the same faith. And so they were able to mix. And they began replanting the garden with these seeds that they were given. But at the same time, they began to go through additional lessons where they learned about human rights and freedom of belief and the dignity. They began to talk to one another and really break down their prejudices and their fears of one another, the fears that we talked about at the beginning. And so at the end, they came back and the garden was beautiful. And the teacher said, what did you learn? And one of the young Yazidi boys said, I thought all of the kids were like ISIS, all these Muslims, but I realized that, I was working with this one. I realized he's just like me. And we were both forced out of our homes. And another kid said, I think that it's really hard to rebuild, and what we faced is so hard in our country, but this lesson has given us hope that we don't have to suffer anymore. We don't have to be afraid of each other anymore. We can actually move forward in peace, and that there's hope. And that was really the lesson that we then turned into the story for The Peaceful Garden. And the book is really designed around Iraq to honor the different religious communities that suffered so much, not just the Yazidis, but the Christians as well, and so many others. And then as we were training teachers, other teachers had other analogies for their lessons that they wanted to develop as a result of our work. And so we have, I think, 4 or 5 books now from teachers across the Middle East and North Africa that we've published this past year, which people can find on our website at hardwiredglobal.org under curriculum and resources. So then they're all available on Amazon as well. But yeah, we've published about 4 or 5 books, and then Fruitopia, which is kind of like our main book, was actually written by me. It's something that I use to in our actual training. Is religion can be such a hard topic to talk about, especially in countries where it's such a sensitive, taboo in many ways. And so we talk about fruit, and fruit allows us to get to the core of who we are as human beings and the inherent dignity that all people have, and have really difficult conversations about a lot of things that would be otherwise too sensitive to have. So
that's neat. And you can find Tina's book Fruitopia on Amazon and at other booksellers as well. Tina, I want to ask you a couple more questions here. You brought up the whole like the little boy who looked at his kind companion there and said, hey, I thought everybody was like ISIS, but I realized this little boy's just like me. And, I wonder, I know that a lot of American Christians, a lot of us here, we hear about the atrocities that ISIS has committed, and we think of, 9/11 and what happened there. And we sometimes link Muslims with, all Muslims with those groups. And yet, I think what you're describing it's much more complex than that. Not all Muslims are like that, right? There are different types of Muslims, just like there are different types of people of every other faith, right? How would you describe, from your experience, the attitude of, the majority of Muslims? And I realize, of course, you have the two main branches, the Shiites and the Sunnis and so on and so forth. And you can get into that if you want. But how would you describe the attitude of the majority of Muslims in Iraq, for example, or in these other places that you work, towards terrorism and some of the atrocities that are taking place there?
Well, I think that, it's important for people to understand that Muslims are actually more persecuted, perhaps than any other group in societies that are predominantly Muslim. So, it's something that we often don't consider. And, I would encourage people to look up the Pew Research Center's global restrictions on religion data, because it does provide a really good overview of what those restrictions look like. Blasphemy and apostasy laws really hurt Muslims as much as anyone else, because they can't speak freely. They don't have the freedom to change or to choose their beliefs. And so in one of the laws in particular in Iraq that we were dealing with was a law, it was called Article 20, where the government, actually the parliament passed it, and the Prime Minister just didn't sign it, thankfully, but it was because of the outrage of groups of both Muslim and non-Muslim faith across Iraq that the law said that if one parent is a Muslim, then the child's identity card needs to be changed to be a Muslim. And so even if that parent converted to Islam or whatever case it might be, that child really doesn't have a choice. They're automatically declared a Muslim. And so all of these groups stood up and said, this is a bad law. It's not okay. It's not okay for you to change our children's belief or identity card based on whatever, the parent does without the other parent's, support. And so we saw that law not pass in Iraq, which was a huge triumph. But across the world, Christians are probably the most numerically, the most persecuted group. Muslims come next. But disproportionately, the Jewish community is the most persecuted group. So groups are persecuted all over the world. I often, when we're doing trainings, for instance, in India, I think India is probably a good example, the Muslim community and the Christian community are equally oppressed by the Hindu majority. In China, the Uyghur Muslims and the Christians in the underground church are equally persecuted, if not Uyghurs more so, because they actually have their organs harvested, and it's pretty horrific what's happening there now. And like the Falun Gong, same thing. But all that to say that in every country there's a group that's probably being persecuted, and so it's not, sadly, I would never say that these things emanate from religion, although people use religion to justify persecution. I really think it's just a human problem where people seeking power are going to use religion and other means to justify controlling other human beings. And so, whether it's in Russia, in the former Soviet Union countries, or in communist China or North Korea, you name it, Venezuela, Cuba, we could go down the list. It's just, it's really authoritarian regimes, people that want to suppress thought and conscience, belief for their own ends, either out of fear or out of power.
So how do we as American Christians, to really get down to the nitty gritty, how do we as American Christians help right now those who are being persecuted around the world? What are some practical ways? I know we can donate to organizations. I want to talk about your organization and how we can help there, but what are some other ways maybe beyond that that we can help?
So I think that it's very important for people to, number one, just be aware. There's plenty of news and stories out there about these issues. So make yourself aware and make others in your circle aware. Social media is a very, very powerful tool. It's how people in closed countries communicate. And so you can help them have a voice by sharing what's happening and not letting it be ignored. I think that's, probably one of the most powerful tools that we have. And it might sound simple, which is in some ways good because it doesn't cost anything to do that.
Mhm.
So that's one simple thing. It is important that we do things around the world, but ultimately, if we're making this a priority here at home, then it will be. And, as you know, I worked for the U.S. Congress, and my ability to help defend people that were persecuted around the world in the U.S. Congress was really because of members of Congress that were personally concerned or who had constituents that were personally concerned. And so you should understand your power and your ability to influence your member of Congress on these issues is really critical. There's Anna Eshoo from California. I'm not sure if she's retiring or she's still there, but she was always a strong advocate on the Christians and the Chaldeans in Iraq, because I think she's Chaldean herself. So, I think that's important. I think that to the extent that you can raise these issues within your local communities, in schools or in public libraries, I think that's also useful. I mean, there's plenty of things that you can do, but I think really just not being silent is one of the most important things that you can do.
Lifting our voices. Yeah. Well, Tina, this has been a great conversation. Thank you for highlighting, something that some of us may not be aware of, and just giving us insight into these places you visited and the work that you're doing. I would like to make sure that people know how they can support your work, on a financial level, or get involved with any opportunities you might have. So give us your website address for Hardwired Global again.
Sure. So it's hardwiredglobal.org. And if you can Google it and find it. It's hardwiredglobal.org. And we have a lot of resources on there. We have, as I said, the children's books, but we also have training videos on there. We have videos that you can share that draw attention to the situation in Iraq and other issues around the world. And then reports and research that we've written. So there's a lot on there that can be useful to you in your desire to learn more about these issues and to be a resource to others on them. And then, of course, I think that it would be great if they followed us on social media. So it's hardwired.org is our handle on most all of the social media platforms. So if you would follow us there, that would. Yeah. And then, I think that one of the biggest ways, so Hardwired has two things. We have these legal trainings, and then we have teacher trainings around the world. And we're running those across the Middle East and North Africa in particular. But we are also going to be doing some of those here in the United States. So if you are a teacher or a lawyer and you're interested in getting involved with us, reach out to me at tina@hardwiredglobal.org. If you want to donate and support a particular project, generally, or in a particular country, let us know. We were in Morocco right before COVID hit last year, and the King of Morocco his top advisor was hosting us there, who is one of the most prominent Jewish men in the Middle East. And he was hosting us with ministries of education from across the region. And we were showcasing our work with schools and ministries of education and the work that we'd done in Iraq, for instance. And it was really encouraging for them to see a model that could be replicated in their country. So now we have a lot of opportunities, but we don't have the resources. And the work in Iraq is so critical. We have a 2.5-year project that we're in the middle of, or that we're working on, and we do need support to continue to retrain all those teachers and children in northern Iraq. And it's so important that we don't leave these children vulnerable to the hateful and intolerant ideas that they were indoctrinated with. And so if you want to help us rescue those children, you can reach out to me, and I'd love to tell you how you can get more involved in that as well.
Wow. Those are some neat opportunities. Well, and I'm excited myself. I'm going to, I'd like to dialogue with you a little bit more sometime about how, my wife and I can get involved and help. And so I know there are others out there who are listening, and hopefully you will be moved to help to support Tina's work as well. Tina, thank you so much. Thank you for the work you're doing. I love it. God's really using you. And thank you again for taking the time today to talk with us.
Oh, you're welcome. It's so great to be with you. And I appreciate everyone that is concerned about people around the world that are being persecuted. I think that, as a Christian, it's a great testament and witness for us that we don't need to, beat people over the head with this, that we believe that truly it is one of the greatest freedoms that God's given us is to choose to follow him, and everybody should have that same freedom. So
absolutely. Amen. All right. Well, happy 4th of July. And
thank you.
thanks
You
again.
too. All right. Take care.